A global financial order cracked open overnight across continents, stunning analysts who believed existing power structures were stable and untouchable. Over the last 3 years, several African nations accelerated repayment of massive IMF and World Bank debts, quietly weakening the leverage those institutions traditionally used to shape national policy for decades. What does this turning point actually mean for global influence, for ordinary observers, and for leaders such as Ibrahim Traoré watching closely right now? The answer may redefine financial power much sooner than expected across the world starting now. You are about to hear an explanation most public discussions still avoid because it exposes how financial power actually operates behind official narratives and diplomatic language. You will gain a clearer lens to interpret global economic signals earlier and more accurately. Ignore what follows, and it becomes easy to misread these events as routine debt repayments rather than a structural shift in leverage. Miss this pattern, and headlines will seem reassuring while deeper changes move quietly underneath. Overlook it, and decisions made by governments, institutions, and figures like Ibrahim Traoré may appear symbolic when they are in fact strategic responses to a transforming system. Those who understand the mechanism early gain an advantage in perception, timing, and judgment. Those who do not often realize the shift only after its consequences become impossible to ignore. What looks like routine debt repayment is actually a shift in who holds leverage. In November 2023, Zambia restructured $6.3 billion of external debt. And that single event quietly altered how financial authority operates. That moment mattered because for years the country had negotiated under strict external oversight that influenced budget decisions, public wages, and subsidy policies. Once the debt load became manageable, that oversight mechanism weakened almost immediately. The change was procedural on paper, yet structural in consequence. Before this point, the pattern had been predictable. Commodity price swings reduced revenue stability. Revenue instability forced borrowing. Borrowing triggered conditions. Those conditions shaped domestic policy choices. It functioned like a closed circuit when global commodity prices rose after 2021. Driven by post-pandemic demand, supply tensions, and energy transition minerals, the circuit began to loosen. Countries earning more from copper, cobalt, oil, or cocoa suddenly faced less urgent refinancing pressure. Less pressure meant fewer imposed conditions. Fewer conditions meant more room to decide independently. This shift did not happen everywhere at once, but it appeared across multiple cases. Ghana, after inflation above 60% in 22, pushed it toward an IMF program, gained breathing room as gold prices strengthened and oil output improved. Discussions about exiting early had already begun. The tone from lenders changed as well, moving from directive language to cautious observation. It indicated that influence tied to debt weakens when debt shrinks. Observers who track geopolitical signals, including figures such as Ibrahim Traoré, recognize that leverage in international finance rarely disappears, it changes form. What is unfolding is not a dramatic rupture but a structural adjustment in slow motion. The visible headline is repayment. The hidden development is autonomy. And the first actors affected are governments that suddenly realize they have more policy space than they did before. A useful guide to understanding this transition is the institutional observer who watches leverage rather than headlines. Analysts inside multilateral finance began noting a subtle but telling shift. Countries once described as under program discipline started being described as monitoring risks. One senior policy economist, commenting after Zambia's restructuring, noted that the most important change was not the debt figure itself, but the disappearance of urgency in external oversight discussions. Pressures softened, the balance at the table adjusted. One early illustration came from West Africa. A fiscal advisor involved in regional consultations described a meeting where officials spoke more freely once refinancing pressure eased. Previously, proposals were framed around what lenders would accept. This time, they were framed around what domestic priorities required. The difference was procedural in form yet strategic in meaning. It showed that policy tone can shift before policy substance visibly changes. A second example surfaced in East Africa. A central banking specialist observing sovereign financing trends noted that when alternative funding channels appeared, negotiations that once took months began closing faster. The reason was simple. When a state has only one option, conditions dominate. When it has several, negotiation replaces compliance. That pattern repeated often enough to stop looking coincidental. These early signals convinced seasoned observers that something structural was underway rather than episodic. And from that point forward, the situation was no longer routine. The shift began quietly. A payment cleared. Then another. Debt balances dipped. At first, nothing dramatic appeared, no emergency summits. Just numbers moving. Zambia finalized restructuring. Ghana stabilized revenue. Nigeria signaled options. Each step looked isolated, each was not. Pressure loosened, terms softened. Negotiators adjusted tone. External monitors recalculated risk, lending language changed. Observers leaned forward. Commodity prices held firm, copper stayed valuable. Oil output improved, cocoa retained strength, revenues rose, fiscal gaps narrowed. Urgency faded. Alternatives surfaced. Bilateral deals emerged, regional talks intensified, choice entered the room. That moment mattered most. Choice changes leverage, leverage changes behavior, behavior changes systems. Institutions reacted. Statements grew cautious, forecast notes lengthened, risk sections expanded. All of it telling. Then acceleration hit, repayment sped up, negotiations shortened. Conditions weakened, governments paused, advisors recalculated. Signals crossed borders, officials compared notes. Finance ministers spoke quietly. Central bankers coordinated. Regional blocs explored alignment, momentum spread. West Africa stirred. Coordination hinted, shared signals formed, shared strategies were drafted. Shared timing was considered. Regional leverage increased. Not everyone welcomed it, some lenders warned. Analysts flagged overheating. Commentary stressed discipline. Concern replaced confidence. Speed increased anyway. Talks concluded faster. Deals closed earlier. Reviews softened. Authority diffused. Leverage shifted sides. Borrowers gained voice. Creditors recalibrated. Negotiation replaced instruction. Figures tracking global power noticed. Strategic observers took notes. Ibrahim Traore followed closely. Such shifts rarely announced themselves. More patterns emerged. Debt ratios declined. Refinancing risks eased. Policy space widened. Domestic debates intensified. Planning horizons lengthened. The chain reaction continued. Governments reconsidered subsidies. Wage decisions reopened. Infrastructure plans revived. Social spending discussed. External pressure lost weight. Not vanished, reduced, still present, less binding. Investors adjusted models. Rating agencies revised outlooks. Forecast bands widened. Confidence language softened. None of this random. Reactions stacked quickly. Occurrence, spread, reinforcement. A three-step escalation. First change, then recognition, then response. Soon the aftershocks appeared. Diplomatic tone shifted. Technical visits shortened. Conditional phrasing declined. Consequences settled in slowly. Governments realized room existed. Citizens sensed possibility. Analysts recalculated assumptions. Irreversibility became the question. Could leverage return? Would dependency rebuild? Might markets reverse? Uncertainty thickened. Still, one fact stood firm. Control tied to debt weakens when debt shrinks. The environment now feels different. Quieter, tenser, more open, less predictable. Nothing collapsed, yet nothing stayed the same. For decades, high debt meant strict external oversight. Now, shrinking debt is reducing that oversight. That single reversal explains why analysts are shifting from watching loan totals to watching leverage dynamics. The scale of the change becomes clearer when the numbers are placed side rather than viewed in isolation. In November 2023, Zambia restructured $6.3 billion of external obligations, That figure matters because it marked the first successful sovereign restructuring under the G20 Common Framework, showing that negotiated relief can restore policy flexibility. The importance is not the amount alone but what followed immediately after it. Once the burden eased, the intensity of outside monitoring dropped, and domestic authorities regained room to set priorities without waiting for approval signals. A second indicator comes from inflation pressure. Ghana's inflation rate exceeded 60% in 2022 during its debt crisis phase. That number signaled severe macroeconomic strain and justified external intervention at the time. Yet when commodity revenues strengthened and financing options diversified, the same country began discussing an early exit from its support program by 2024. The contrast between those 2 points shows how quickly financial positioning can shift when revenue conditions change. A third metric highlights structural limits. In many African economies, tax revenue remains below 15% of gross domestic product. This ratio matters because it indicates how much a state can finance development internally without relying on foreign lenders. When that percentage is low, dependence rises. Autonomy expands. Some countries have spent the past decade strengthening collection systems precisely to move that number upward and reduce vulnerability to outside conditions. Timing adds another layer. Global commodity prices entered a sustained upswing driven by post-pandemic demand, supply disruptions, and energy transition minerals. That shift increased export income for producers of copper, cobalt, oil, and agricultural commodities. Higher revenues narrowed fiscal gaps. Narrower gaps reduced borrowing urgency. Reduced urgency weakened conditional leverage. Each step follows logically from the previous one, forming a measurable chain rather than a theoretical argument. Another quantifiable factor is financing diversity. When a government can choose between multilateral lending and bilateral project-based loans, negotiating power increases. But it changes bargaining math. Creditors must compete, terms soften. Decision space widens. Put together, these figures carry weight beyond statistics. They show magnitude, speed, and human consequence at once. Large sums signal scale. Structural ratios signal long-term capacity. When all three move in the same direction, analysts treat it as evidence of systemic transition rather than temporary fluctuation. The conclusion emerging from the data is steady and difficult to dismiss. This is not simply a story about countries owing less. It is a story about how measurable financial thresholds can quietly reshape who holds influence, who sets conditions, and who ultimately decides policy direction. Some analysts argue that the apparent shift in financial leverage is being overstated and that external institutions still retain decisive influence over national policy choices. They note that global capital markets, credit ratings, and reserve currencies remain largely controlled by advanced economies, meaning any country that diverges too sharply from accepted fiscal norms could still face currency pressure, capital flight, or borrowing constraints. Recent debt repayments do not signal structural change, but rather a temporary easing made possible by favorable commodity cycles. If prices fall again, dependence could quickly return. That concern has weight because commodity-linked economies have historically experienced boom and bust cycles. When export prices drop, revenue contracts, deficits widen, and governments often seek external financing again. Critics therefore argue that what looks like autonomy may simply be a cyclical window rather than a permanent transformation. They emphasize that institutions such as the IMF still shape global financial standards, risk models, and investor expectations even when countries are not formally under programs. A second counter-argument focuses on alternative financing sources. Some observers warn that replacing multilateral or resource-backed financing does not eliminate dependency, it merely changes its form. Can lock countries into long-term delivery commitments that limit policy flexibility just as much as traditional conditional lending. Under that interpretation, the system is not loosening but mutating, shifting from policy surveillance to asset-linked obligation. Yet when both critiques are examined together, a clearer pattern appears. The evidence does not suggest that external influence has vanished, nor that new financing channels are inherently liberating. Instead, the data indicates that bargaining power is becoming more distributed. Countries with multiple financing options, stronger domestic institutions, and improved revenue streams can negotiate terms rather than accept them outright. Those without such advantages remain constrained. The result is not a single continental trajectory, but a divergence between states gaining negotiating leverage and those still reliant on external direction. Placed side by side, the opposing interpretations do not cancel each other out, they define the boundaries of reality. External power still exists, domestic agency is increasing. A system no longer defined by one-sided control, yet not free from constraint either. Everything changes at this midpoint. A development few expected began drawing attention among strategic observers. Coordination signals started appearing across West Africa, not as public announcements but as aligned fiscal timing and shared monetary discussions. When neighboring states begin adjusting policy cycles in parallel, analysts recognize a deeper shift than routine reform. It suggests preparation, it suggests calculation, it suggests intent. This is where the pattern turns. Individual debt reduction is one thing, regional synchronization is another. When countries act separately, creditors negotiate case by case. When countries move in clusters, leverage multiplies. The cost of pressuring one state rises if others can respond collectively. That possibility alone alters negotiation dynamics before any formal alliance is declared. Such coordination does not require treaties to matter. Markets react to signals, not ceremonies. Institutions notice tone, diplomats notice language. Each notice feeds the next reaction. Observers tracking geopolitical momentum, including Ibrahim Traore, understand that influence rarely collapses in a single moment. It redistributes through sequences. What appeared earlier as isolated financial improvement now looks more like early stages of structural alignment. And once alignment begins, outcomes stop being predictable. The consequences no longer stay inside policy rooms. They begin showing up where decisions touch daily life. What looked like a technical financial adjustment starts translating into visible shifts across institutions, markets, and households once the midpoint transition takes hold. For governments, the first effect is pressure mixed with opportunity. When external conditions loosen, responsibility concentrates internally. Leaders can no longer attribute unpopular fiscal choices solely to outside requirements. Policy ownership increases. That raises expectations from citizens and legislators alike. It also raises risk. But it also bears full accountability if outcomes fail. In several states watching these trends, advisors note that cabinet discussions now focus more on domestic priorities than lender compliance schedules. Businesses feel the change through uncertainty and possibility at the same time. When countries gain negotiating leverage, regulatory directions can shift faster. Energy or infrastructure must reassess projections because contract terms, tax structures, or public investment plans may evolve. Some investors interpret this flexibility as opportunity, expecting governments to fund development projects that stimulate demand. Others interpret it as volatility, worrying that policy adjustments could alter operating conditions. Either way, corporate strategy departments are paying closer attention to fiscal signals than they did a few years ago. For ordinary citizens, the impact is more tangible. When debt pressure eases, governments sometimes regain space to discuss wage policies, subsidy programs, or social spending priorities. Even the possibility of such discussions can affect public sentiment. People begin to anticipate changes in living costs, employment opportunities, or public services. The psychological effect alone matters. A population that senses room for national decision-making often becomes more engaged in political debate because outcomes appear less predetermined by external mandates. At the regional level, ripple effects extend further. Neighboring states monitor each other's fiscal progress closely because one country's success can alter negotiating dynamics for the rest. If several governments signal that they have alternatives to traditional financing, external institutions must adapt their approach to the entire region. That creates a multiplier effect in diplomatic and economic relations. Observers note that figures such as Ibrahim Traore are watching these regional signals carefully, since coordinated leverage can influence trade, security cooperation, and development planning simultaneously. The broader realization settling in among analysts is simple and weighty. The consequences are no longer theoretical. They are unfolding across state strategy, corporate calculation, public expectation, and regional alignment all at once. And once effects spread across all layers, no participant remains untouched. The most probable path forward is steady but uneven adjustment rather than sudden transformation. Financial conditions are likely to continue shifting gradually as long as commodity revenues remain relatively stable and countries maintain access to multiple financing channels. Under that scenario, external institutions would still influence policy through markets and advisory roles, yet governments would retain more negotiating room than they had in previous decades, producing moderate stability mixed with periodic tension. A more optimistic outcome could emerge if states use this expanded policy space to strengthen domestic institutions and invest in long-term productivity. If tax systems improve, public spending becomes more efficient, and regional coordination deepens, fiscal resilience could rise significantly. That would reduce vulnerability to commodity cycles and allow development strategies to be planned years ahead instead of crisis to crisis. Leaders including Ibrahim Traoré would operate within a framework where external pressure exists but no longer dictates core national decisions. The worst-case scenario, however, remains plausible if newly gained flexibility is mismanaged. If governments accumulate fresh debt without productive investment, or if revenues are diverted into short-term political spending, the same vulnerabilities that once triggered dependence could return. Borrowing costs could rise, and external lenders would regain leverage. In that case, the current shift would prove temporary, remembered as a brief window rather than a lasting transition. What matters most is not predicting which scenario will occur, but recognizing that each remains possible. The direction depends on choices made now by policymakers, institutions, and societies that must decide how to use the room they have gained. After seeing the larger pattern and the possible paths ahead, the most important question becomes personal rather than geopolitical. What does this actually mean for someone watching from outside policy circles, but living inside the global system shaped by those decisions? The answer depends on how closely a person pays attention to signals like these and how prepared they are to interpret them. For those who actively follow international economic shifts, this moment offers an informational advantage. Understanding how leverage structures change allows them to anticipate policy moves, market reactions, and diplomatic realignments earlier than most. But it does provide clarity, which is often the difference between reacting late and adapting early. For people affected indirectly, the impact arrives through second-order effects. Job markets, investment flows, currency stability, and trade conditions all respond to changes in national policy autonomy. Even without direct involvement, individuals may notice shifts in prices, opportunities, or economic sentiment as governments adjust strategies. Preparing mentally for variability helps reduce surprise when those shifts occur. There is also a third group who assume events like these have little relevance to their lives. Remaining disengaged may feel comfortable, yet it carries its own risk. When structural changes unfold quietly, those who ignore them often encounter consequences without understanding their cause. Awareness does not require expertise, it requires attention. No matter which group someone belongs to, recognizing the significance of systemic change ensures they are not caught off guard by it. Real solutions cannot remain slogans once structural leverage begins to shift. If new policy space is opening, the decisive factor becomes how that space is used and who takes responsibility for turning opportunity into measurable outcomes. The question is no longer whether change is possible. The question is how it should be executed. At the leadership level, the first step is institutional strengthening within a defined time frame. Governments must prioritize revenue systems, transparent budgeting, and independent oversight within the next fiscal cycles. Success can be measured through clear indicators such as rising domestic revenue ratios, reduced emergency borrowing, and shorter budget approval timelines. When those metrics improve, autonomy becomes durable rather than temporary. Leaders including Ibrahim Traore and others observing these dynamics understand that policy freedom without institutional discipline rarely lasts. The second step belongs to economic systems and organizations. Financial authorities, development banks, and private sector partners need to translate flexibility into productive investment within operational planning horizons. That means directing capital toward infrastructure, industry, and human capital rather than short-term consumption. The effectiveness of this step can be tracked through output growth, employment expansion, and stability in sovereign risk assessments. Confidence compounds and dependency declines further. The third step rests with citizens and civil society. Public awareness and scrutiny should increase alongside policy autonomy. Monitor spending and evaluate whether promised reforms actually occur. This step does not require mass mobilization. It can be measured through participation rates in civic processes, independent reporting activity, and public access to fiscal information. In some regions, a fourth step may emerge through cross-border cooperation. Coordinated fiscal frameworks or shared financial platforms could strengthen bargaining power and reduce vulnerability to external pressure. Synchronized monetary adjustments or regional funding mechanisms that reduce reliance on outside lenders. Execution determines outcomes. Policy space only matters if it is used wisely, consistently, and visibly. Think back to that earlier moment when the tone in negotiation rooms shifted and seasoned observers realized something subtle had changed. The image of officials speaking more freely once pressure eased still lingers, because it marked the first visible hint that authority was redistributing rather than disappearing. That quiet turning point now feels different after tracing everything that followed. From that initial signal to the present stage, the journey has moved through evidence, resistance, adjustment, and consequence. What began as scattered financial developments gradually revealed itself as a structural transition affecting how influence is exercised. Along the way, analysts, institutions, and leaders such as Ibrahim Traore have all been reading the same pattern from different angles, each recognizing that the meaning of leverage was evolving in real time. Seen together, these events form more than a sequence of economic updates. They tell a story about responsibility, choice, and the weight carried by decisions made when constraints loosen. Moments like this test whether autonomy becomes progress or simply another phase in a repeating cycle. The outcome depends not on headlines but on actions taken once attention fades. This was never just about debt or finance. It is about who ultimately shapes the future. The balance of power is being rewritten. What stays after a story like this is rarely just information. Each listener carries away a slightly different interpretation, shaped by their own experiences, priorities, and expectations about how the world works. That diversity of perspective is not a weakness. It is what turns observation into understanding, and understanding into meaningful discussion. If this analysis felt worth your time, it may also be worth letting others encounter it so they can examine the same signals and reach their own conclusions. When more people look closely at how global systems shift, conversations become deeper, more precise, and more useful for everyone involved. Shared awareness often begins with one person deciding a topic deserves wider attention. There is also value in hearing how others interpret what you just heard. Some may see warning signs, others may see opportunity. Both reactions add dimension to the conversation and help refine how complex events are understood. So consider this an open invitation to reflection and dialogue. Which detail in this story do you think matters most right now?